The air was thick with dampness, the kind that clung to wool coats and seeped into collars. It was a Sunday in the 1950s, and the narrow streets of a Yorkshire mill town still carried the faint tang of coal smoke, hanging heavy over rows of brick terraces. Rain had fallen earlier, leaving the cobblestones slick, glistening beneath the weak glow of gas lamps. Down the road, the church bells had only just ceased their solemn toll, their echo lingering like a reminder of duty. But now, another sound was rising, one that made the heart beat a little quicker, the brassy swell of a local band striking up its march. At first, it came faintly, carried on the wind, the deep thrum of a tuba, the bright chatter of a cornet. Then, as the players rounded the corner, the music filled the street completely, commanding attention with its boldness. Men in flat caps leaned against doorways, wiping their hands on aprons after Sunday dinners of meat and to veg, while children darted into the street, their boots splashing through shallow puddles as they followed the rhythm. Women stood with arms folded, smiling despite themselves, a few nodding in time with the beat. Brass bands had long been the pride of Yorkshire's industrial towns. Born out of collieries and textile mills, they were more than mere entertainment. They were symbols of community, discipline, and resilience. Each note carried the weight of shared labor and the promise of escape from the endless grind of factory hours. On weekends, when the machines fell silent and the streets filled instead with voices, the brass bands became the heartbeat of working-class pride. Inside the band itself, every player was part of a ritual. The cornets gleamed under the lamplight, their polished bells flashing as fingers danced across valves. The trombones slid with practiced grace, their long brass arms catching droplets of mist in the night air. The drummer, a stout man with rolled-up sleeves, kept the beat steady, his sticks tapping against the rim with the precision of a ticking clock. They were men who had spent the week down in the pits or bent over looms, but on Sundays they were musicians, and in those moments the music was theirs alone. Children in the crowd jostled closer, their eyes wide, not yet understanding the discipline behind the sound, but feeling the power of it nonetheless. One boy clutched his father's hand, tugging with excitement each time the cornet rose in a triumphant phrase. His father, still smelling faintly of coal dust even after a scrub at the sink, looked down with a quiet pride. Perhaps, he thought, one day the boy would join them, taking up the instrument he had once dreamed of playing before the pits had claimed his youth. The smell of roasted chestnuts drifted faintly from a vendor's cart nearby, mingling with the metallic temps of brass and the dampness of the cobblestones. A woman hummed softly along, her voice barely audible above the swell of the band, but in her eyes there was the glimmer of memory of dances held in local halls, of wartime evenings when music was both solace and defiance. The band had played then, too, though under darker skies. Now, a decade later, the echoes of war still lingered in these towns, but the music carried a promise of renewal. As the players shifted into a hymn-like tune, the atmosphere softened, the rowdy clutter of children stilled. Even the gulls circling overhead seemed to pause. The notes rose, rich and mournful, filling the space between the houses with something almost sacred. The brass carried emotion, in a way words never could: sorrow, endurance, hope, all braided together in the sound. For a moment the street became a cathedral, the worn cobbles and soot-streaked walls glowing with the dignity of shared music. When the last note faded, there was a silence almost as powerful as the sound itself. Then came the applause, modest but heartfelt. Some clapped politely, others whistled, and a few, overcome by the sheer force of pride, simply nodded in gratitude. The bandmaster, A tall figure with a weathered face raised his hand in acknowledgement. He knew what this meant. He had seen men join the band after 12-hour shifts underground, their bodies aching, but their spirits lifted by the music. He had seen young boys grow into players, and old men bow out with trembling fingers, their instruments handed down like heirlooms. As the crowd began to disperse, the younger lads in the band lingered, instruments tucked under their arms, eyes still bright from the performance. One of them, a lanky youth with a cornet too big for his narrow frame, caught sight of a girl standing at the edge of the crowd. She was wrapped in a shawl, her cheeks flushed from the cold. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, the damp, grey evening seemed to dissolve into something warmer. She smiled shyly, and he raised his cornet in a playful salute before hurrying to catch up with his mates. It was a fleeting connection, but one that carried the sweetness of possibility. The street slowly settled back into its quiet rhythm. Windows glowed with the soft light of oil lamps, and the smell of stewing tea drifted out as families prepared for the long workweek ahead. But the music lingered, echoing faintly in the mind like a song half remembered. Even as silence reclaimed the cobblestones, the brass band had left its mark, stitching together the fabric of community with every note played. And somewhere, not too far away, in another corner of England, a very different kind of music was beginning to stir. One that would shake the old traditions and set the youth dancing to an entirely new beat. The first thing that struck you wasn't the sight of the crowd, or even the smell of beer clinging to the brick walls. It was the sound. Down in Liverpool, in the early 1960s, the beat seemed to come from everywhere. It thumped through the cobbled back streets, spilled from open pub doors, and lingered in the air like smoke. The city, with its red brick terraces, bustling docks, and seagulls crying overhead, was alive with a rhythm that was entirely its own. At the heart of it all was a place that would become legend. The Cavern Club, tucked away on Matthew Street. You had to descend a steep, narrow staircase, the air growing warmer and thicker with each step, until suddenly you were inside. The walls were curved brick, arched like a tunnel, dripping with condensation. The smell of damp stone mixed with cigarette smoke and spilt beer. It was dark, claustrophobic, and electric, an underground womb where something new was being born. On that night, the crowd pressed close, shoulder to shoulder, their breath rising in the humid air. Young men in narrow trousers and slicked hair leaned against the walls, nodding to the beat. Girls in pencil skirts and beehive hairdos swayed together, their laughter cutting through the thrum of amplifiers warming up. The entry price had been just a shilling or two, barely the cost of a pint, and yet what they were buying was priceless, a ticket into a revolution. Then the music began. The guitars hit with a raw energy, not polished, not refined, but urgent. The bass rattled the chest, the drums kicked steady like a racing heartbeat. It was nothing like the polite dance hall orchestras of the decade before. This was faster, louder, more alive. The sound borrowed its swagger from American rock and roll, but twisted it with Liverpool's own rough-edged humour and working-class grit. The crowd felt it instantly, the sense that they weren't just listening to songs. They were witnessing the start of something bigger than themselves. Outside, the docks were still Liverpool's backbone. Men hauled cargo by day, their hands rough with rope burns, their clothes dusted with flour or coal. The city carried the marks of post-war hardship. Rationing had only ended a few years before, and bombed-out buildings still gaped like broken teeth between the shops. Yet, within this landscape of resilience, the beat was a spark. It gave the young a sound that was theirs alone, separate from the weary voices of their parents. One boy in the crowd, barely 17, pressed forward until he was almost against the stage. His father had spent his life working the docks, but tonight the boy was dreaming of something else. His eyes locked on the guitarist, sweat dripping down his brow as he shouted into a microphone that barely contained the energy of his voice. In that moment, the boy felt a surge of recognition. If they could do it, why not him? He glanced sideways at the girl beside him, her face glowing in the dim light, her hand tapping out the rhythm against her skirt. She caught his eye and grinned. It was a fleeting moment, but in that grin, he felt the entire promise of the future. Between songs, the air grew hotter, the condensation dripping faster from the low ceiling. Someone passed a bottle through the crowd, and laughter broke out as it changed hands. A scuffle started near the back, quickly swallowed by the music as another riff cut through, sharper, brighter. The walls seemed to vibrate with each note. The cavern wasn't glamorous, its bricks were stained. The air often stank, but to those packed inside, it was sacred ground. Word was already spreading. Names like Gary and the Pacemakers, Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, and of course, the Beatles were whispered in excitement across the city. They were local lads, most of them barely older than the kids in the crowd, yet they carried with them the weight of a movement. Soon, it was said, London would come calling. Perhaps even America. But in this moment, here, in Liverpool, it was theirs. Above ground, Matthew Street was slick with drizzle, the neon lights of nearby pubs glowing against wet pavement. The faint thrum of bass could be felt even from outside, seeping through the brick like a heartbeat. People walking past paused to listen, some curious, others shaking their heads at the noise. To them, it was just another racket from another cellar. To those inside, it was destiny. The boy with the dockworker father left the cavern late that night, ears ringing, his shirt damp with sweat. The streets were quiet now, save for the echo of seagulls and the distant hum of the Mersey. He walked slowly, reluctant to let the night end, replaying the songs in his head. He could still feel the girl's smile, still taste the hope that had filled the room. The city might be grey, the days might be hard, but there was music now, music that belonged to him and his generation. As he turned a corner, he caught sight of a group of lads carrying guitars in battered cases, laughing, their breath rising in the night air. They looked like ordinary boys, but he knew they were anything but. They were the spark, and soon their fire would spread. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was just how far that fire would reach. That, within only a few years, the sound born in those damp basements of Liverpool would travel across oceans, fill stadiums, and change the face of popular music forever. But for now, it was just a beat in the night, pulsing through the streets of Liverpool, drawing kids into cellars, and promising that something extraordinary had begun. And while the city swayed to its new rhythm, far to the south, in London's Soho, another kind of sound was finding its own restless audience. The first thing you noticed wasn't the fashion, though it was impossible to miss the jagged hair-dyed neon green, the safety pins glinting in leather jackets, the graffiti-splattered denim. What struck you first was the sound. It came tearing out of the shop fronts and clubs of King's Road in the late 1970s. Raw and jagged, guitars thrashing like chainsaws and drums pounding like fists on a locked door. London was restless, and here, in Chelsea's most notorious street, the unrest had found its anthem. It was a cold evening, the kind where the air smelled faintly of petrol fumes and rain-soaked tarmac. Street lamps cast their orange glow across puddles that reflected the chaos of the road. Punks swaggering in Doc Martens, couples in long overcoats rushing past with looks of disapproval, and shop windows plastered with posters advertising gigs for bands with names that sounded like threats. At the heart of this movement was more than just music, it was attitude, defiance, the sense that the old England was cracking, and something feral was breaking through. Inside clubs, like the Roxy or dingy backrooms above pubs, the crowds were crammed together, shoulder to shoulder, sweat dripping down the peeling walls as bands ripped through 2-minute songs that were less about melody than about rage. The Sex Pistols had lit the fuse only months before. Their snarling voice, sneering at the establishment, had shocked the country. No future wasn't tea, just a lyric hit, was the bitter truth for many of the kids who gathered here. Unemployment was rising, strikes crippled industries, rubbish piled up in London's streets. For the young working class, opportunity felt as thin as cigarette smoke in a cold wind. And so they turned to this sound. Jagged, loud, unpolished, but theirs. A group of teenagers leaned against the wall outside a record shop halfway down King's Road, the cold biting through their torn clothes. One lad, his hair spiked into impossible shapes with sugar water, tapped a cigarette against his boot, waiting for the others to head inside. The shop's doorway was a portal to another world. Piles of vinyl records cluttered the counters. Fanzines were stacked like manifestos, and the air smelled of musty cardboard mixed with leather and hairspray. From a battered speaker overhead, the Clash blared gritty, relentless. A voice that felt as though it had been forged in the same streets. Inside, a girl with black eyeliner thick as tar flipped through records, her fingers leaving smudges of ink on the glossy sleeves. She glanced up at the boy with spiked hair, and for a fleeting moment, there was connection, shared rebellion in their eyes. They didn't need to speak. The music was their language. By nightfall, the clubs grew louder. One by one, kids streamed down into basements, where condensation dripped from low ceilings and the floors shook with every stomp. The bands weren't polished, most could barely play 3 chords, but that was the point. The imperfection was honesty. Each song was like a brawl in sound. Short, violent, unforgettable. The crowd responded with the same energy. Bodies slammed into each other in frantic rhythm, sweat flying, boots thudding against sticky floors. A bottle smashed near the bar, someone shouted, and the band only played harder. For the kids packed inside, there was no government, no classroom, no dull queue, only this room, this noise, this fleeting freedom. But beyond the chaos, there were smaller, more tender moments. In a corner of one club, beneath the flicker of a failing light bulb, 2 punks pressed close, their foreheads touching as the music raged around them. They shared a cigarette, the smoke curling between them, and for just a minute, the world shrank to nothing more than their clasped hands and the pulsing beat. Punk might have been built on anger, but it carried its own fragile kind of intimacy. Outside on King's Road, the scene itself was becoming theatre. Tourists arrived to gawk at the punks as though they were exhibits, snapping photographs of the spiked hair and torn clothes. Some locals muttered about hooligans and troublemakers, shaking their heads as they hurried past. But, for the ones who lived it, every night felt like history. They weren't simply dressing differently or listening to a new genre, they were tearing down the polished veneer of post-war England and replacing it with something raw, something that demanded to be heard. Shops like Vivian Westwood's Sex became gathering points, temples of rebellion where clothes looked like armor. Safety pins weren't just accessories, they were statements. Union Jacks were shredded, stitched, and worn with deliberate disrespect. Even the way they walked, the swagger, the scowl, was performance. Punk was more than a sound. It was a way of being, a way of saying no to everything that had been handed down. By the end of the night, King's Road quieted, though echoes of music still spilled faintly from a few clubs. The rain had started again, thin and misting, softening the sharp edges of graffiti on the walls. The boy with the spiked hair walked beside the girl from the record shop, their boots splashing in puddles. Neither said much. They didn't need to. The night itself had spoken for them, every note and every stomp carrying the weight of their generation's frustration. As they turned a corner, they passed a shuttered pub, its walls plastered with posters of bands already beginning to fade. New ones were rising just as quickly. That was the truth of punk. It wasn't built to last. It burned bright, chaotic, like a match flaring in the dark. But for those who had lived it, those who had pressed against each other in the sweat and noise of King's Road, the sound would never fade. And in the years to come, when the spikes had dulled and the records warped with time, the memory would remain of that street where London roared with rebellion, and where the future, however uncertain, had once sounded like guitars played too loud and voices shouting into the void. Yet, even as punk shook London to its core, elsewhere in England, another rhythm was echoing through the street, softer, older, but just as full of pride. The rain had only just stopped, leaving the paving stones of Covent Garden slick and shining under the weak light of a winter afternoon. The market square bustled with its usual mix of tourists, flower sellers, and buskers, their voices rising against the grand arches and columns that framed the space. Somewhere, the smell of roasted chestnuts drifted into the cold air, mingling with the tank of damp stone and the faint sweetness of mulled wine. And then, as if on cue, the first notes began to echo, soft, hesitant, almost drowned by the chatter of the crowd. It came from the corner where an upright piano, weathered and chipped from years of use, stood beneath the arches. A young man in a wool coat had slipped onto the wooden bench, his fingers brushing the keys with the caution of someone testing cold water. At first, a few turned their heads in passing curiosity, assuming it would be another tune half-played, another musician lost in the noise of the square. But then the sound began to rise. The melody was clear and deliberate, a thread weaving its way through the murmur of voices and the shuffle of boots on stone. It wasn't hurried, nor was it performed with the flourish of a showman. It was steady, honest, carrying the kind of sincerity that made strangers pause in their steps. A child tugged at her mother's hand and pointed, her eyes wide. The mother slowed, smiling faintly, as if she too had felt the pull. Soon a circle began to form. Commuters who had rushed across the square on their way to the tube slowed and drifted closer. Tourists leaned on their umbrellas, grateful for an unexpected performance. Even the pigeons seemed to settle, their restless wings folding as though they too wanted to listen. The sound carried differently in that space. The arches of Covent Garden caught each note and held it, echoing it back with a faint shimmer, as though the building itself had become an instrument. The piano, despite its chipped keys and worn pedals, seemed suddenly grand, transformed by the intimacy of the moment. The young man's hair fell into his eyes as he played, his expression somewhere between concentration and release. It was empty, just the notes that filled the square. It was the weight of memory woven into them. His grandfather had once played in pubs along the Thames. Old upright pianos rattling in smoky rooms where pints of bitter clinked against wooden tables. Those stories had been passed down like heirlooms, and now, in his own quiet way, the boy was carrying them forward. A woman wrapped in a red scarf stepped closer, her eyes shining with recognition. She leaned toward a stranger beside her and whispered, "That's Chopin." But the man only nodded absently. Labels didn't matter in this moment. To the crowd, it wasn't about composers or technique, it was about the hush that had fallen. The unspoken agreement that for just a few minutes, the rush of London had slowed. And then, just as the melody softened into a near whisper, something shifted. The pianist moved seamlessly into a new rhythm, one that pulsed with warmth and playfulness. A ripple of laughter spread through the listeners as the tune became familiar. It was Let It Be. The Beatles, reborn on a battered piano in the heart of London. A man in a bowler hat began to hum along, his deep voice shaky but sure. A group of students joined in, their accents tumbling together, American, French, Irish united in a single refrain. Even the child who had tugged at her mother's hand now mouthed the words, her small voice lost in the swell. It wasn't a performance anymore, it was a gathering. The sound rose above the square, climbing into the grey sky as though it might carry beyond the rooftops, beyond the city itself. For those few minutes, the square was a living room, the piano its hearth, and the strangers gathered around were a family. When the final chord lingered, the silence that followed was thick with something more than absence. It was gratitude, reverence, the kind of stillness that comes only when people know they've shared something rare. Then the applause came spontaneous, joyful, ringing against the arches like another kind of music. The young man, cheeks flushed, gave a small, awkward bow before standing to leave. He hadn't come to perform. He had come to play. But now, the memory of it belonged to everyone who had been there. As the crowd slowly drifted apart, the piano stood silent again, its keys reflecting the dim winter light. Yet those who had stopped carried the sound with them. The mother whispered to her child about her own father who once sang Beatles songs in the kitchen. The man in the bowler hat hummed under his breath as he disappeared into the tube. The students laughed together, already replaying the moment in their minds as a story to be told later. London is a city always in motion, its rhythm driven by footsteps, trains, buses, and the endless rush of time. Yet here, in the pause of a street piano, something different had been offered. It was a reminder that amid the grey stone and constant hurry, beauty still lingered, unexpected, unplanned, fleeting, but no less powerful for it. And as dusk began to fall over the city, the square returned to its usual rhythm, the chatter of vendors, the shuffle of tourists, the call of pigeons taking flight. But the piano waited patiently, silent, until the next pair of hands would sit down, press the keys, and let music spill once more into London's air. What none of those listeners knew was that, just a few miles away, in another corner of the city, a very different kind of sound was pulsing from record shops and basements, a sound louder, angrier, one that rattled the old order as much as this piano soothed it. The rain had been steady all afternoon, the kind that blurred the outlines of London's buildings and left a fine mist clinging to every coat and umbrella. Covent Garden was slick with puddles, the cobblestones reflecting a patchwork of grey sky, golden lamplight, and the soft shimmer of shop-front windows. People hurried through the square, shoulders hunched against the drizzle, their footsteps quick and sharp against wet stone. And then, suddenly, something cut through the damp monotony, a sound that was not the shuffle of boots, nor the clatter of carts, but music. It came from beneath the arches, where a weathered upright piano stood like an invitation to pause. The young man who had claimed it wore a long wool coat, the collar turned up against the chill, his hair still wet from the rain. He sat, hunched slightly forward, fingers coaxing sound from the keys with a quiet confidence. At first, it was soft, almost tentative, the notes threading delicately through the steady patter of rain. But soon, the melody grew bolder, echoing against the stone arches, demanding to be heard. One by one, people slowed. A woman in a red umbrella leaned closer, her eyes softening as she recognized the tune. A pair of tourists, camera straps dangling from their necks, stopped mid-step, the sound tugging them into stillness. Even a group of school children, noisy and restless only moments before, quietened as the piano's voice rose above the city's hum. The piece was neither showy nor rehearsed. It carried with it the warmth of a memory, the kind of tune that feels both familiar and new. The piano itself bore the marks of countless other hands, chipped paint along the edges, keys yellowed with age, faint graffiti carved into its wood. Yet, in that moment, it was transformed, its imperfections becoming part of its charm. As the music swelled, the square itself seemed to change. The rain softened to a fine drizzle, falling like a curtain around the gathering crowd. The air smelled of roasted nuts from a nearby stall, mingling with the faint mineral scent of whetstone. A busker strumming a guitar nearby lowered his instrument and watched, recognizing that the center of attention had shifted. The young man played on, eyes half closed, his expression far away. Perhaps he was remembering something, a kitchen at home, where a parent once played the same tune on an old upright, or a childhood lesson long ago that had lain dormant until this moment. Whatever it was, the music carried more than skill. It carried intention. And then, without warning, the piece shifted. The careful classical cadence gave way to something warmer, more soulful. A rolling left hand laid down a heartbeat rhythm, and the right began to dance, playful and free. It was the kind of music that could make you forget the rain, that could coax a smile even from strangers. The crowd felt it immediately. Feet tapped beneath umbrellas. Someone clapped softly in time. A young couple, emboldened by the beat, swayed together, their laughter mingling with the notes. The square, only minutes before a grey blur of damp coats and weary faces, had been transformed into a shared living room, strangers united by sound. When the final chord rang out, the silence that followed felt heavy, almost reluctant. Then came the applause, louder than expected, echoing through the arches. The young man smiled shyly, lifted his hands in a small wave, and stood. He hadn't come for recognition. He had only come to play. But now, as he disappeared into the crowd, the people who had paused in the rain carried something with them, reminder that beauty, however fleeting, could appear without warning. A woman whispered to her friend that it reminded her of her father, who used to hum the same tune as he shaved in the mornings. A boy tugged at his mother's sleeve, asking if they could get a piano at home. A man with tired eyes pulled his scarf tighter, but, for the first time all day, he was humming. The square returned to its rhythm, the busker strummed again. The children regained their chatter, umbrellas clicked shut as the drizzle eased, but the piano remained, waiting for the next set of hands to bring it to life, to spill music once more into London's restless air. And yet, hundreds of miles away, in a northern town where the nights were long and the mills cast their shadows across terraced streets, a different kind of music was stirring. It was faster, harder to contain, played not on rain-soaked pianos but through trembling speakers in dance halls that pulsed until dawn. It was the sound of northern soul, where young people, restless and wide-eyed, danced until their shoes wore thin and the music felt like it might carry them into another life altogether. The night air in Wigan was damp with mist, the kind that clung to your hair and seeped into your clothes. It was the mid-1970s, and the town centre, with its red brick buildings and shuttered shop fronts, looked quiet under the flickering glow of sodium lamps. But down one particular street, there was nothing quiet at all. From behind the doors of the casino club, the bass lines throbbed, rattling windows and sending vibrations through the pavement. The sound was relentless, pulsing like a second heartbeat for the town. Outside, kids gathered in anticipation, their breath fogging in the cool air. Wide trousers swung with every movement as they practiced spins and shuffles on the wet pavement, their shoes skimming over patches of oil-stained concrete. The music leaking through the walls, rare American soul imports, faster and brighter than anything on mainstream radio, was a promise. It was the call to a night that could stretch until sunrise. The fashion was unmistakable. Oxford bags flared at the ankle, button-down shirts clung damply in the mist, and patches of sweat already formed under heavy parkas discarded on the steps. Some wore badges of obscure Motown labels pinned to their lapels, proof that they weren't just dancers but disciples. For Northern Soul wasn't simply about music, it was about belonging, about taking a sound imported from Detroit, Chicago, and Philadelphia and claiming it as the pulse of Northern England. Inside, the casino was already alive. The hall was hot, humid, the air thick with cigarette smoke, and the smell of beer sloshed onto sticky floors. A single mirrored ball sent shards of light spinning across hundreds of faces, each one turned towards the music. The DJ, perched high above the dance floor, dropped another track, a rarity. The kind of 7-inch single that collectors scoured record shops for months to find. The crowd roared as though they had been given a gift. Then the dancing began in earnest. This wasn't the sway of a pub crowd or the shuffle of a disco. This was athletic, frantic, precise. Dancers threw themselves into backdrops, spins, high kicks, the soles of their shoes gripping and sliding in perfect rhythm. Sweat flew as they moved, yet no one seemed to notice the heat or the exhaustion. The music demanded everything, and they gave it gladly. Near the edge of the floor, a boy in his late teens leaned against a pillar, clutching a bottle of pop bought with his last coins. His eyes followed the dancers with awe. He had spent weeks practicing alone in his bedroom, the needle of his turntable scratching grooves into the few records he owned. Now, standing here, he realized just how far he still had to go. Yet there was no envy, only determination. He wanted to be out there, in the center of it all, part of the movement. As the night went on, friendships formed in fleeting glances and shouted words over the music. A girl with hair curled high caught the boy's gaze, grinned, and pulled him onto the floor. His steps were clumsy at first, his shoes slipping, but the crowd didn't care. They clapped him along, urged him forward, and soon he found himself spinning, his wide trousers fanning out like sails. When he fell out of rhythm, the girl steadied him with a laugh, her hand warm against his wrist. It was a moment of kindness amid the frenzy, and it gave him the courage to keep moving. The hours melted away. The DJs fed the floor with track after track, each one rarer, faster, more euphoric than the last. Records by artists few had heard of. Dobie Gray, The Tams, Gloria Jones became anthems. The crowd moved as though wired to the same current, every body caught in the electricity of sound. Time didn't matter. Outside, the town slept under its blanket of fog, but in here, the world was alive. By dawn, the dancers stumbled out into the cool morning air, their shirts plastered to their backs, their legs aching but their hearts still racing. The mist had lifted slightly, and the first buses were beginning to rattle down the streets. The boy sat on the curb, his chest still heaving, the girl beside him lighting a cigarette. They didn't speak much, but the silence was comfortable. They had shared something that didn't need words. For those who lived it, the Northern Soul nights were more than escapism, they were liberation. In towns where work was hard and futures uncertain, these nights gave the young a chance to be extraordinary, if only for a few hours. The music, the dancing, the camaraderie, they were acts of defiance against boredom, against limitation, against the idea that life had to be ordinary. The casino itself would close before the decade was out, its walls eventually torn down, its heartbeat silenced. But in the memory of those who danced there, the music never faded. The spins and the shuffles, the sweat and the laughter, the records played until their grooves wore thin, all of it lived on, echoing in every hall and club that dared to keep the spirit alive. And as those kids dispersed across the north, their memories carried with them like secret treasure, the music spread to, spilling into seaside towns, where old dance halls overlooked the glittering lights of Blackpool, and where the night promised yet another rhythm waiting to be claimed. The sea air was sharp with salt and vinegar, the unmistakable tang of fish and chips mingling with the dampness that rolled in off the Irish Sea. Blackpool, in the 1960s, was alive with light and sound, fairground rides clattering, the cries of gulls circling overhead, and, most of all, the music that poured from the grand old dance halls lining the seafront. As dusk fell, the promenade glowed under strings of bulbs and the famous illuminations, their colours shimmering on the wet pavement after a brief rain shower. Couples strolled arm in arm, laughter carried by the wind, while groups of teenagers lingered in doorways, waiting for the night to begin. The Winter Gardens, the Tower Ballroom, the Empress names whispered with excitement. Their doors swung open to release bursts of music into the night air, notes tumbling out to meet the rhythm of waves crashing against the seawall. Inside, the world was transformed. Chandeliers glittered above polished dance floors, and mirrored walls reflected the kaleidoscope of dresses, shoes, and suits moving in rhythm. The bands, set high upon stages, played everything from big band swing to the new rhythms creeping in from America rock, N-roll, soul, rhythm and blues. The air inside a Blackpool dance hall was thick with perfume, cigarette smoke, and the faint musk of sweat from hundreds of bodies pressed close. Girls in bright dresses with full skirts twirled beneath the lights, their laughter rising above the brass section's blast. Boys slicked their hair back with Brylcreem, collars stiff, shoes polished to a mirror shine. Some danced with awkward steps, others moved with practiced precision, throwing their partners into spins that drew cheers from the onlookers lining the walls. For many, the journey to Blackpool had been half the thrill. Special weekend trains brought young people from across Lancashire, Yorkshire, and even further south. They arrived with little more than a suitcase and the promise of music, cramming into cheap boarding houses run by landladies who left stern notices about no visitors after 10 p.m. But once night fell, those rules were forgotten. The halls called to them, and every penny saved from weeks in the mill or the factory was spent on entry tickets, pints of bitter, and maybe a plate of chips after midnight. A young couple slipped onto the floor at the Empress, their fingers brushing nervously before locking together. The band struck up a familiar tune, smooth, swaying, and suddenly the boy forgot his awkwardness. The girl's dress flared as they turned, her laughter bright against the brass. Around them, the crowd moved as one great tide of color and rhythm. For a brief moment, the war years of austerity felt like a distant memory, and the economic hardships of the present were drowned out by music. At the Tower Ballroom, the famous Wurlitzer organ rose from the floor like a magician's trick. Its booming, warm tones filled the cavernous hall, drawing gasps from newcomers. Couples glided across the expanse, the polished wood shining beneath their feet. Elderly dancers, veterans of decades past, moved gracefully alongside younger couples finding their rhythm for the first time. It was a place where time blurred, tradition and modernity mingling in every step. Outside, the promenade was alive with those too restless to stay indoors. The music spilling from the halls carried across the open night, blending with the hum of amusement arcades. The mechanical clatter of the pier, and the gulls' insistent cries. Young lads practiced dance steps under the glow of street lamps, wide trousers swishing as they spun. Girls shared cones of chips, giggling as they dipped into the salt and vinegar. Somewhere in the distance, a busker with a battered accordion added his own soundtrack, offbeat but no less spirited. As midnight approached, the dance halls only grew hotter, louder, more frenetic. Records spun between live sets, the latest American imports sending the floor into a frenzy. Northern soul tracks crept into the playlists, demanding athletic spins and backdrops. The crowd erupted, sweat dripping, shoes squeaking against the wood. Yet, amid the chaos, there were always tender moments, hand resting on a shoulder, a whispered joke between steps, a fleeting kiss exchanged as the lights spun overhead. By the early hours, the music slowed. Couples swayed to ballads, their heads resting against each other's shoulders, while the rest of the crowd caught their breath. Outside, the streets were quieter now, the last chip shops closing, the sea air cooling as the tide crept in. The halls began to empty, their doors spilling tired but glowing dancers onto the promenade. Some linked arms and sang, their voices hoarse but joyful. Others walked quietly, shoes in hand, the night's energy still pulsing through their veins. For those who had come from far away, the journey home would begin at dawn. Trains rattling back across the north carried boys and girls who would spend the ride replaying the night in their heads, the songs, the spins, the glances across the floor. They would return to mills, factories, schools, and shops, but the music lingered. Blackpool had given them a taste of escape, a chance to be part of something bigger than their daily grind. Years later, when the grand halls began to fade and disco lights replaced live bands, those who had danced there would still remember the thrill of that music spilling onto the seafront. They would remember the way the gulls circled overhead, the salty chips eaten under neon lights, the moment when the band struck a note so perfect it seemed the whole world paused to listen. And as Londoners rushed to their trains and buses in the years to come, another kind of music would rise in unexpected places, not from glittering dance halls, but from the tiled tunnels of the underground where buskers with guitars, violins, and voices filled the daily commute with echoes of a city that never stopped singing. The morning began with the usual din of London underground life. The metallic screech of brakes, the hiss of doors, and the shuffle of hundreds of shoes on worn concrete. It was the early 1980s, and King's Cross Station was a world of grey. The tiles on the walls were dulled with soot and grime, the air thick with the mingled scents of damp coats, cigarette smoke, and the faint chemical temps of machinery. Commuters moved like currents in a river heads down, collars up, eyes glazed with the habit of routine. And then, against that mechanical monotony, came the sound of strings. It was faint at first, barely cutting through the echo of train doors slamming, but soon the melody grew clearer. Someone had claimed a corner of the tiled tunnel, a young man with a battered guitar, its body scratched, its strings slightly out of tune. His coat was frayed at the cuffs, and his fingers were red with cold. But when they pressed against the frets, something warm rose out. The tune was simple, a few chords looped over and over, but it carried with it a pulse that softened the hardness of the tunnel. His voice followed rough around the edges, but earnest, full of life. He sang of streets and rain, of chances missed and found again. In a space usually filled only with announcements and the clatter of footsteps, the sound seemed almost miraculous. People slowed. Not many, most still hurried on, their briefcases clutched tightly, their minds already on the office. But a few lingered. A woman in a navy skirt suit dropped a coin into the open guitar case, her shoes clicking softly as she walked away with the faintest of smiles. A schoolboy leaned against the wall, his satchel slipping from his shoulder, caught by the rawness of the sound. Even the station guard, usually quick to chase away loiterers, paused at the top of the steps, his stern expression easing just slightly. There was something about music underground, it filled the tunnels differently. The notes bounced from wall to wall, echoing, multiplying, until one guitar sounded like many. The acoustics gave the impression of a cathedral built of tile and steel, turning a corner of the station into a makeshift concert hall. The young man's breath misted as he sang, his voice rising above the mechanical groans of another train pulling in. For a moment, the song and the city seemed to merge. The rhythm of the trains, the beat of footsteps, and the chords of his guitar all weaving together into a kind of accidental symphony. As the song ended, a scattering of applause came from those gathered. The boy with the satchel grinned, clapping louder than anyone, his cheeks flushed with excitement. The busker nodded, a shy smile breaking across his face. He hadn't come expecting much, not money, not fame, but in that moment he had given strangers something rare. A pause, a breath, a reminder that even here, beauty could exist. He launched into another tune, this one faster, brighter. A few people tapped their feet, another tossed a coin into the case. A man on his way to work in Brixton lingered longer than most, his head tilting as if recognizing something in the rhythm. When the busker finished, the man leaned down and spoke softly, his voice colored with the warmth of the Caribbean. "You've got something there, mate. Ever tried playing reggae?" The busker shook his head, chuckling, but the suggestion lingered in the air as the man disappeared into the flow of commuters. For in Brixton, only a few stops away, the streets themselves were singing. By afternoon, Electric Avenue would be alive, with music pouring from shop fronts and market stalls. Reggae bass lines, heavy enough to rattle windows, throbbed through the pavements, accompanied by the smell of jerk chicken sizzling on roadside grills and the vibrant colors of fruit piled high in crates. There, the music wasn't a pause in the rush of life, it was the heartbeat of the community, constant and undeniable. The young man in the tunnel strummed on, unaware that beyond the trains and tunnels, another rhythm was Kalinga, rhythm born of resistance, joy, and belonging. A rhythm that would shape the sound of London itself in the years to come. The summer of 1976 was unlike any other. London baked under weeks of relentless heat, pavements shimmering in the haze, the air thick with the smell of dust and warm asphalt. In Brixton, the heart of South London's Caribbean community, the streets pulsed with their own rhythm. On Electric Avenue, shopfront speakers, balanced precariously on windowsills, poured out the sounds of reggae deep bass lines that seemed to shake the pavement. Hi-hats clicking like cicadas, voices stretched in soulful defiance. The market was alive. Crates of mangoes, plantains, and Scotch bonnet peppers spilled onto the street, their colors as bright as the carnival costumes stored in back rooms for the coming August parade. Women bargained loudly over the price of fish, their voices rising above the music, while the scent of jerk chicken and patties drifted from food stalls, smoke curling into the hot air. Even the bus conductors, standing by their idling route masters, tapped their fingers on the handrails, unconsciously moving to the rhythm. Children darted between stalls, licking dripping cones of ice cream that melted faster than they could eat. A boy carried a portable cassette player on his shoulder, its tiny speakers bravely spitting out Gregory Isaacs and Burning Spear, though their sound was quickly swallowed by the larger shop systems booming with Bob Marley's Exodus. Each shop seemed to compete, turning the street into a patchwork of overlapping rhythms, a living jukebox of the Caribbean transplanted to London soil. But reggae was more than music. It was identity. For the Windrush generation and their children, these rhythms were threads tying them back to Jamaica, Trinidad, Barbados. In a country where too often they faced suspicion or outright hostility, the music built community. It was a language shared across borders, uniting neighbors with every throb of bass. In a corner by the butcher's, an older man leaned against the wall, his Panama hat tilted against the sun. He rolled a cigarette slowly, his fingers stained with tobacco, and hummed softly to the rhythm coming from the speaker above his head. He remembered the first time he had stepped off the boat at Tilbury Docks in the late 1940s. The strangeness of grey skies and cold rain. The music hadn't been here then. It had arrived with them, carried in records wrapped carefully in suitcases, in memories of Kingston dance halls, in the sway of hips at Saturday gatherings in rented halls. Now it spilled freely into the streets, uncontainable. A younger man passed by, his hair twisted into neat dreadlocks, his t-shirt emblazoned with the red, gold, and green of Rastafari. He carried a speaker on his bicycle trailer, the bass rattling the wheels, and he nodded respectfully to the elder. The two men locked eyes for a moment, past and future, in a single glance before the younger pedaled on, weaving through the throng with music trailing behind him like a banner. The heat made tempers quick, and not every exchange in the market was friendly. A policeman stood at the corner, helmet tilted back, his gaze sharp but wary. Tensions in Brixton simmered in those years, poverty and policing grinding hard against pride and survival. But even he couldn't entirely ignore the rhythm. His boot tapped once, betraying him, before he caught himself and shifted stiffly against the lamppost. As the afternoon lengthened, the music only grew louder. A sound system was being assembled at the far end of the street, huge wooden speaker boxes stacked like building blocks, wires snaking out in every direction. A crowd began to gather. Soon records were spinning, the bassline heavy enough to vibrate through the chest, the kind of sound that demanded you move. Young men in wide collars and flared trousers took to the center, their feet sliding across the tarmac in practiced steps. Girls clapped their hands to the rhythm, their laughter ringing over the top of the track. The crowd swelled until the street itself seemed to dance. Shopkeepers leaned in doorways, nodding their heads. The air shimmered with heat, with spice smoke, with rhythm layered upon rhythm. Somewhere in the mass of movement, a boy and a girl brushed shoulders, their eyes meeting briefly before they were swept apart again. For an instant, all the noise and color and heat narrowed into that single glance, a spark in the haze. By evening, as the sun dipped behind the terraces, the music mellowed. Lovers' rock drifted from the speakers, slow and tender, wrapping the street in softness. Couples leaned close, swaying gently, while the younger children began to nod with sleep on their parents' shoulders. The market stalls closed, one by one, but the music lingered, unhurried, carrying the warmth of the day into the cooling night. Reggae had turned Electric Avenue into something more than a marketplace. It was church, carnival, and home all at once. It was defiance sung sweetly, a reminder that even in a city that sometimes turned its back, there was still joy to be found, still pride to be claimed. And far from the crowded streets of Brixton, beyond London altogether, another kind of music was rising in England's evenings. In country churches tucked between hedgerows and fields, voices lifted, not in reggae, but in hymns. Choirs sang into the chill of stone walls, their harmonies glowing like candlelight against stained glass. The settings were different, the rhythms worlds apart, the spirit was the same. Across the land, England was alive with music, each corner carrying its own heartbeat. Frost lay thick across the fields, the kind that turned every blade of grass silver and made the hedgerows sparkle as though dusted with glass. The evening air was sharp and still, the kind that seemed to magnify sound, carrying even the faintest echoes across the valley. In a small village, tucked deep into the folds of the English countryside, smoke curled from chimneys into the winter sky, while in the square, the ancient stone church stood with its tower etched black against the fading light. Inside, the air was warmer, though not by much. The scent of beeswax polish clung to the pews, mingling with the faint mineral smell of stone dampened by centuries of winter rains. Candles flickered in sconces along the walls, their flames bending each time the heavy oak door creaked open. The stained glass windows, dark against the night outside, caught what light they could, the reds and blues glowing softly in the flicker of the candles. This was rehearsal night, and slowly, one by one, villagers slipped inside, teachers, farmers, shopkeepers, children still tugging off mittens stiff with frost. They stamped their boots against the flagstone floor, their breath rising in white clouds before settling into pews and benches. There was no uniform, no great ceremony, just scarves tucked into pockets, spectacles adjusted, a rustle of sheet music passed around. Yet, when the choirmaster raised his hand, the chatter fell away, replaced by a hush that carried its own kind of reverence. The first notes were tentative, the voices cold and unused, but soon they began to swell. Sopranos rose like birds lifting from a hedgerow, altos grounded them in warmth, while tenors and basses filled the gaps with depth. The music rose to the rafters, echoing among the wooden beams, until the whole church seemed to vibrate with sound. The draught that crept under the doors no longer mattered, nor did the frost pressing against the windows. For within those stone walls there was heat enough in song. A girl near the front clutched her sheet tightly, her voice small at first. She had only joined the choir that autumn, coaxed by her teacher after she'd been overheard singing in the schoolyard. Now, standing among villagers decades older, she felt the tremor of nerves in her throat. But then, in the pause between verses, the choirmaster caught her eye. He gave a nod, not grand, just enough. And when she sang again, her voice was stronger, carrying clear and pure above the harmony. Her father, sitting 2 pews back, lowered his head slightly, pride settling in his chest like a weight. Outside, the village lay silent under the stars, the crunch of frost on footpaths muted by distance. But from within the church, the sound carried faintly through the air, slipping through the cracks in the stone, drifting across the fields where sheep huddled against dry stone walls. A man walking home from the pub slowed his step, tilting his head to listen. The notes, softened by the cold night, seemed to glow in the dark, a reminder that even in the quietest corners of England, beauty lingered. As the rehearsal deepened, the music shifted. The choir moved from hymns into carols, voices blending into familiar patterns that felt older than the walls themselves. In the bleak midwinter echoed through the nave, the words almost too fitting for the frost biting just beyond the door. For a moment, time seemed to blur past and present folding into one. Generations of villagers had stood in that very spot, singing those very words, candlelight flickering just the same. Their echoes seemed to mingle with the voices of the living, a chorus across centuries. Between songs, there was laughter too. Someone fluffed a note, another came in too early, and soon the mistake rippled into chuckles that warmed the room more than any stove could. A boy fetched biscuits from a tin, passing them down the pews. Someone poured tea from a flask into steaming cups, the smell of strong black brew cutting through the damp air. These were small moments, yet they stitched the community together as surely as the hymns did. The choirmaster clapped his hands once more, and silence returned. This time, the piece was longer, more demanding, Handel's Messiah, its notes ambitious for a village choir, but beloved all the same. The opening was rough, but slowly the voices aligned, strengthened, grew bold. By the time the Hallelujah chorus rang out, the walls themselves seemed to glow. It was not perfection, not the polished sound of cathedral choirs, but it was something richer. The sound of ordinary lives lifted into harmony, and in the midst of it, connections were made. A glance between neighbors who rarely spoke beyond polite greetings. A smile shared across the rows as voices merged in the same line. A hand brushing against another as sheets of music were passed. The choir was not just about singing, it was about remembering that no one voice, however strong, could ever fill the silence alone. It took all of them, gathered here on a frosty evening, to make the music whole. At last, the rehearsal ended. Sheets were stacked away, scarves pulled tight once more. The oak door creaked open, letting in a blast of cold air. Candles guttered, their light bending in the draught. One by one, villagers stepped out into the night, their boots crunching on the frozen ground. Their breath rose in clouds once more, but their hearts carried the warmth of the music. The girl who had found her voice walked beside her father, her cheeks pink from both cold and pride. He placed a hand on her shoulder and said nothing, but she understood. The music had bound them both into something larger than themselves, something that would echo long after the frost melted. Behind them, the church stood silent again, its tower dark against the stars. Yet inside, the air still seemed to vibrate faintly, as if the walls themselves remembered the song. Tomorrow it would be still, empty save for the toll of the bell. But come another evening, the choir would return, and once again, voices would rise to meet candlelight flickering against stained glass. For in the quiet of England's villages, as in its cities and seaside towns, music had always been the thread binding past to present, stranger to neighbor, sorrow to joy. And on nights like this, in stone churches glowing with candlelight, you could almost believe that the songs would never fade.